is a great joy and honor for me to make some comments on Professor Willie Jennings' learned and insightful presentation titled Creating Home, Forming Christians Who Believe in Creation and Creatures. In this two-lecture series, I have been invited to make comments on the first lecture, The Path of Shared Perceiving. There are many reasons why this task strangely warms my heart, not least because Dr. Jennings is such a luminous scholar, an innovative writer, and a close friend of Fuller. It also has to do with the fact that as recently as the past week, I finished teaching a doctoral seminar here at Fuller in which we studied carefully Professor Jennings' landmark work titled The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Grace. Having had another chance to spend time with that programmatic writing, similarly to the Bible text, it became alive again, and it spoke very powerfully to the PhD seminar's theme on post-colonial issues and the Christian doctrine. The defining concept in that book, following the title, is imagination, or Christian imagination, or perhaps Christian social imagination. Reading Professor Jennings' current patent lectures under consideration, I heard the same voice speaking here in the lecture. It is about the ways of imagining, rightly or wrongly. In the book itself, Professor says, and I quote, "There is within Christianity a breathtakingly powerful way to imagine and enact the social, to imagine and enact connection and belonging." He continues, "Indeed, I argue here that Christianity in the Western world lives and moves within a diseased social imagination. I think most Christians sense that something about Christians' social imagination is ill, but the analysis of this condition often don't get to the heart of the constellation of generative forces that have rendered people's social performances of the Christian life collectively anemic. Christian theology now operates inside this diseased social imagination without the ability to discern how its intellectual and pedagogical performances reflect and fuel the problem, further crippling the communities it serves." End quote. As said, in today's lecture, Professor Jennings turns his analysis onto another area of imagination, and it is an area which at first sight might not be obvious when it comes to right or wrong perceiving or imagination, namely creation. I take the term perceiving used in the lecture similar in content to the term imagination used in the book that I just read a citation from. And I appreciate very much the way our distinguished speaker defines what it means. He says, "By perception, I include the ways of thinking and living." Yes, it is not only about thinking, it is also about living in the world that God has created. This is the focus of the current presentation by our professor. How to perceive or imagine the doctrine of creation Christianly in a world plagued by colonial wound. The dear professor's claim is simple and profound, namely that there is a lack of real doctrine of creation, and I have to confess that it is a quite surprising claim for a systematic theologian. I happen to think that perhaps there are already too many Christian treatises onto the doctrine of creation. Do we need one more? That is what Dr. Jennings believes is the case. And the reason is obvious. In his mind, our, and I quote, problem is the lack of a real doctrine of creation, end quote. Note this short, important word, which the speaker also emphasized in the beginning of the presentation, namely real. My first question to Professor Jennings is this. It would be useful to know more about what is really meant with this code word, real. Having stressed its importance several times with some helpful descriptions, the term totally disappears in the rest of the presentation. A medicine to the sickness of misguided perceiving of creation is this, and again I quote from the paper, exploring the architecture of belief that the God of Israel is our creator and has revealed home and aimed us toward its making by giving us first the shared gift and goal of perceiving, end quote. This will help us get back to the beginnings, real beginnings that only God is able to create. And as the professor says, as created, beginnings are embodied. These embodied beginnings is about the births of the two prophets, John and Jesus, as Elizabeth and Mary respectively received the word spoken by the angel, and new life forms by the energies of the Holy Spirit. As improbable as it was for John's mother to give birth due to old age, and as impossible it was for the Virgin Mother to have a child, it happened. God creates beginnings, embodied beginnings. But that is not yet the whole Christian story of beginnings created by Israel's God. Instead of Israel reading the story of creation alone, and Christians later doing the same, these two readings be brought together, although the order they came into being has to be followed, Israel's first, and then ours as Christian. The Jewish Peter's misguided perceiving of the animals as unclean on the sheet come down from heaven was corrected in Acts 10 for the sake of the Gentiles and also for the sake of Israel, for the sake of common reading of the doctrine of creation. And now we come to the crux of Professor Jennings' thesis, and again I quote, "This is how and where Christian belief in creation begins, in the tense-filled space between Jews and Gentiles, where the God of Jesus Christ reveals a claim through Jesus and by the Spirit, I am your creator and you are my creation," end quote. And he tells us, our homework as Christians is to learn to undo the habit of reading creation doctrine, not only in isolation from that of Israel, but also against Israel. That misreading started early in church history and has had devastating implications to many areas. Now, what do we say of this claim and argument of the presentation by Professor Jennings? Namely, that only through the spectrum of the two embodied beginnings in the beginning of the New Testament, that of John the Baptist and that of Jesus of Nazareth, Christian doctrine of creation can be rightly perceived. As much as I like it for its novelty, and as much as I like everything in its support, I am not quite sure if I'm totally convinced. I have two main concerns, and I'm sure they are directly the result of the lack of learning on my side and my inability to imagine otherwise. But I dare to mention them in the hopes of receiving enlightenment from our speaker. My first concern, I fail to see how this focus on the New Testament birth stories necessarily helps us perceive about creation something that the first story, that of the Torah, is not able to deliver. Isn't the Christian story of creation merely a rehearsal of what the Jewish Torah tells us? And then some Trinitarian clarification, to put it mildly, on the Christian side. Isn't the whole point of the prologue to the Gospel of John, cited by our professor, isn't the whole point to take Christian readers to the very beginning of what Israel's God was doing? Namely, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. In other words, why not first go back to the Torah and let Genesis 1 tell the story? It is also a Christian story, but told by Israel. Then, following the story of Torah, read Genesis 1 Christianly in light of the Second Testament and prologue to John and so on, but as a later commentary, totally dependent on what Genesis 1 is saying. That will also give us the truly cosmic framework of creation, which takes me to my second concern, which is, in my understanding, there might be a danger, or at least a liability, of making the real Christian doctrine of creation too much anthropocentric. By tying it to the coming together of two separated parts of the humanity, that of the Jews and that of the Gentiles. It looks like what has happened to us humans is a very late comer on the cosmic scene. The stars, the heavenly constellations, the rudimentary level living cells in the beginning of the formation of our planet, the dinosaurs and others. They came much, much, much before us. How to link them into the Christian doctrine of creation, not only as an afterthought, but as something very important, or how to link into the Christian doctrine of creation 2 trillion galaxies and their destiny in the creative work of Yahweh, the Father of Jesus Christ. So I'm asking, wouldn't beginning from the Torah rather than from the beginning of the New Testament give us the needed cosmic perspective for a real Christian doctrine of creation? Then, in the subsequent moment, as it were, for the purposes of the New Testament goal of uniting the two peoples, the story of two births would be read, but only as afterwards, after the story of Torah. In sum, it is a matter of where we begin the real Christian doctrine of creation, which is the Jewish story recounted in the Torah. Thank you once again, Professor Jennings, for your highly insightful, innovative, and surprising presentation. What an intellectual and spiritual feast it is.